Which situation are we in today, actually? Are we in a situation where we truly have that level playing field? Or are we, as I would argue, based on the evidence, we actually live in a world where some people are starting various numbers of meters behind. And so in order to reach true fairness, we have to make sure that everyone's start lines are moved to the same place.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm interviewing a researcher who studies gender equality in the workplace. Her work stood out to me as being heavily influenced by quantitative studies on the effectiveness of various interventions aimed at leveling the gender gap in the workplace. I hope we can gain some insights into what is good and what does not work to promote fairness in the workplace. Thanks for tuning in. If you do enjoy what you're hearing, as always, I would love you to press like on your podcast app and come and chat with me on my Facebook group, The Rational View. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to add, I'll be posting a link to this podcast, and you can chat with me there. Siri Chilazi is a senior researcher at the Women and Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School, whose life's work is to advance gender equality in the workplace. As a keynote speaker and strategic advisor, Siri collaborates with a wide range of organizations around the world. Her work regularly appears in leading media outlets. Siri has an MBA from Harvard Business School, a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School, and a BA in chemistry and physics from Harvard College. Her most recent book with co-author Iris Bohnet is called Make Work Fair. Siri, welcome to The Rational View.
It's great to be here, Al. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So you started out in science and then went into public policy. What was the thinking there? Did you have a change of heart in what you wanted to do, or was this always in the book for you?
There was no grand plan. I was always a science geek growing up, absolutely loved mathematics, physics, chemistry. And in fact, when I entered college, that's what I ended up majoring in, indeed, chemistry and physics. But I also expected that to become my lifelong career, that I would become an academic in chemistry and physics. And if I'm completely honest, when I discovered what the day-to-day of a physics professor actually looks like, and that it's much more writing grants in the background, doing research, very independent, less so interacting with students, teaching, being in the classroom. I mean, that component is there too, of course, but it's maybe a smaller component of the job than I had expected. That's what caused me to reconsider my post-college career plans. I initially went into management consulting and sort of more on the business side, but then after graduate school, found my way back into academia, to your point, in a different role and in a different sort of discipline. But I do believe that everything works out the way it's meant to work out.
Very interesting. So I'd love to talk about your book, Make Work Fair. And just I'm going to read out the blurb that I found in it discussing the thesis. Our book is about changing behaviors, not attitudes. The approach we are using, behavioral design, is rooted in insights into how our minds work. It helps us move from virtuous intentions to actions. It allows us to create processes, systems, policies, and environments that help our inherently biased brains nonetheless make fairer and more objective decisions. So this is right in line with the Rational View podcast. This is what we're here for, is to make rational and fair and decisions in public policy. And the last line is, it allows us to change outcomes without trying to tackle people's deeply held beliefs. Is it possible to make things better without changing outdated beliefs?
Well, the magic of behavioral science is that it tells us, yes, it is indeed. And I think this is surprising to a lot of people who logically, right? It's not an irrational assumption to think that in order to change what people do, we have to first change how they think about things and how they feel about things. We've all experienced a lot of these situations in our everyday lives where first you change your opinion, you become informed about how animals are actually farmed, right? And then you say, oh my gosh, I can't possibly eat meat anymore. And then you become a vegetarian, as an example. That certainly happens. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But behavioral science has shown us, and I think this is so incredibly powerful, is that we often can change people's behaviors also without changing those underlying beliefs. And especially when it comes to deeply held values and beliefs around fairness and equity and social justice and some of these topics, it's really difficult to engineer an intervention to change people's beliefs around these issues.
Sure.
Now, it's not that those beliefs never change. There's wonderful research that shows that men with daughters, for example, make more gender equal decisions as judges. They're more likely to vote for public policies that are more gender equal as legislators in the US Congress. And in many other domains too, such as venture capitalists, they're more likely to hire other women into their VC firms. It's actually incredible that we have research to back all of that up. So that's an example of how somebody's life experience, having a daughter, then goes on to influence how they behave in a totally different realm in the workplace. But we can't exactly engineer people to have kids in the first place or specifically for them to have daughters, right? So that's what I say when I mean that it's difficult to engineer interventions that sort of force or cause people to change their minds. Training is a great example. Unconscious bias training, diversity trainings, all these different types of trainings are one of the most popular go-to interventions that organizations gravitate towards when they're thinking about, okay, how do we change culture? How do we get people to behave differently? How do we create an environment that makes more people feel respected and valued and like they belong? And this is something that has actually been extensively studied over the last 5-6 decades. And I am sad to report that there's extremely little evidence to suggest that sitting in a training session or even multiple training sessions actually causes people to change their everyday behaviors. But
that's interesting. I want to mention that. Reading in your book, you said there is little indication that any change in unconscious bias awareness has led to sustainable changes in behavior.
Precisely.
According to the most comprehensive meta-analyses synthesizing evidence from hundreds of studies over the last 2 decades. Why not? There's been so much effort put into this. What's going on?
Well, I think that's precisely because the flow chart of behavior change isn't as simple as give people more information, leads to change their beliefs, leads to different behavior. And that's what we are just starting to unpack is how people behave, the way they behave. It's much more, the determinants of that are much more complicated. I think it'll take easily several decades before we have this figured out from the scientific standpoint. That's why I think the behavioral design approach, which is to say, we can actually bypass all of this and directly change the systems or the processes or the systems that influence us, that surround us, and nonetheless get people to behave in a different way. So let me take a concrete example from the workplace around hiring. There's a lot of awareness these days about the fact that many of the traditional ways by which we hire are highly susceptible to bias. So the way we pick out 10 resumes to interview from a big stack, there's an enormous amount of bias in that. The way we conduct interviews, which are often very unstructured, we sit across from a person, we have their resume in hand, and we say, oh, I see that you also studied physics in college. Oh, this is very interesting. And now look at that. Your hobby is also knitting. Well, me too. And now you build all this sense of similarity with the person that actually has nothing to do with their skills and competencies for the task at hand. So those are just a couple of examples. But humans also get tired. If we're rifling through that pile of resumes, the first resume of the day when we're fresh and full of energy gets totally different attention and mental bandwidth than the 110th resume that comes 5 hours later.
Just before you go home.
Just before you go home, or just before a lunch break, as it were, too. So there's a lot of evidence now to show exactly how these biases come in to influence hiring processes. And most people even are aware of this. The very common approach in organizations has been to say, okay, Let's take all of our colleagues involved in the recruiting. Let's educate them about these biases. Let's explain to them what they are. Let's show them how these biases can negatively impact our decision making. And then let's hope that with that information, they're going to go and make more objective hiring decisions. In other words, we train people.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that hasn't been shown to be very effective.
Now,
again,
just before you go on, again, going back to the book, a quote, diversity trainings generally do not work to change behaviors or improve measurable outcomes. An analysis of more than 40 years of personnel and administrative data from over 800 American companies showed that providing diversity training to all employees was not correlated with the likelihood that women or people of color would become managers. And one of the things I like in this book is the fact that you go back to the studies and you reference the evidence in a lot of this. It's I think, you highlight in the book that the quantitative effectiveness measurements of some of these policies is just missing in most companies.
Yes.
And people are doing these things. They're basically just virtue signaling. But until you close that loop and find out what actually is making a difference in closing equity gaps, you're wasting people's time, right?
100%.
What fraction of the work that's being done is useful? Do we have a feeling that?
Oh my gosh, I don't have a number to put on that, but let's put it this way: there's a lot of room for improvement. And to your point, there's a lot of room for us to bring data and evidence-based approaches to this work. I'm a researcher, so I'm very unideological about this, right? All I want to know is what works and what doesn't, and let's keep doing the studies and doing the research to figure out more practices that work. When do they work? For whom? With what effects? So that we can proliferate those practices in organizations. And I'll just quickly go back to that example from hiring that I was mentioning. So instead of training, what would behavioral design suggest that works much better in this case? It would be simply to tweak the hiring process itself so that we're allowing people's inherently biased brains to make better and more objective decisions. This could include things like determining the questions that we ask all candidates in advance, and then asking all candidates the same questions in the same order so that we can compare candidates' answers horizontally. Making sure that interviewers don't talk to each other and influence each other, but that they grade the candidates one by one so that they can come up with truly independent judgments so that groupthink doesn't muddy the waters. Making sure that when people's scores are then aggregated and final decisions are made, there's often some kind of calibration meeting where all the people involved in the process come together to actually make a final decision, making sure that the loudest voice in the room doesn't sway the conversation at that stage. Maybe the senior partner's best friend's daughter is one of the candidates. Well, that probably isn't a relevant consideration in terms of skills and competencies. So there's a lot of different ways, and often simple, low cost or no cost ways in which we can tweak the process itself rather than trying to tweak or change all the many individual people involved in that process.
Now, early on in your book, and I just want to highlight this one statement that you made. You say at the outset that the book is for the activists working to advance DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusivity, as well as the activists working to limit DEI. This seems a contradictory statement. And a book about making work fair seems like it would support DEI. Can you expand on this statement?
Thank you for highlighting that, Al. We titled the book Make Work Fair because peeling back from all the many acronyms that have been in use in recent years, and by the way, the specific acronyms and words are changing all the time, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, access, respect, value, and various other things. When we peel back from all of that and go back to first principles, so to speak, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? That's part of the conversation that we want to lift up, because a lot of organizations recently have rushed to do things, bring in speakers, organize a training, pledge money towards a cause. There's a lot of activity, but not always a real strategic vision of what are the real outcomes, the real results that we are trying to achieve. And in Iris, as my co-authors and my mind, that ultimate objective that we're trying to achieve is a fair workplace. And what that means for us is a workplace where we acknowledge and accommodate the fact that people are different. Diversity is a fact of life, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. People are different in all different kinds of ways, visible and invisible. The workplace needs to be able to provide all employees a level playing field so that they have an equal opportunity to perform to their fullest potential.
Okay.
Now, people's potential will differ. We all know, right? We've
Sure.
got colleagues, we have friends. Some people are more capable at a certain thing than others. Some people want to gun for the top position and become a CEO or senior leader. Other people will say, you know what? I'd rather work 9 to 5, do a decent job, and then go enjoy my life. That's wonderful. All of these people have valuable contributions to bring to the workplace, and it's the workplace's job, in my view, to structure it in such a way that we can get the biggest maximum contribution from all of these people.
Okay.
That's
So this
fairness.
is an important discussion, I think, in the field of equity. Equal access and opportunity versus equal outcomes.
Yes.
And a lot of people, are hung up on quotas and, let's make sure that the outcomes are the same. And if the outcomes aren't the same, we're doing something wrong. How do you feel about, for example, fairness of affirmative action hiring policies?
Yeah, so I have to just mention quickly, in the United States context, actual quotas are illegal and have always been. Around the world, in many other countries, they're used extensively to improve political participation, pay equity, representation in senior leadership in organizations, and in many other fields. But in the US, you're right, we've of course had affirmative action legislation, but that's not a quota either, meaning a mandated representation of a particular group. Companies are certainly free to set aspirational goals. But the way I think about it really is the following, and I'd like to use an analogy here. Imagine that you've got 2 sprinters that are about to embark on the 100-meter dash.
Okay.
Now, if these 2 sprinters are equally fast, which of them is going to finish first?
The one that starts ahead.
Yeah, oh my goodness. You are getting to the next part of my analogy already, Al. Most people will say, okay, well, if they both run 100 meters, they're going to finish at the same time because they're equally as fast. But to your point, what if they don't both start at the 0 meters line? What if one person's start line is 20 meters behind so that they actually have to run a 120-meter race? Well, of course, if they're equally as fast, they're still going to finish second every time because they have a longer distance to run. So my response to your question about, goals and quotas and affirmative action is we have to ask ourselves, which situation are we in today, actually? Are we in a situation where we truly have that level playing field? Everyone gets to run the 100-meter race. Or are we, as I would argue, based on the evidence, as we laid out in our book, we actually live in a world where some people are starting various numbers of meters behind the starting line. And so in order to reach true fairness, we have to make sure that everyone's start lines are moved to the same place.
Right. Starting lines in the same place. That's very difficult to achieve. And your book goes through a lot of ways to help increase fairness. It also highlights a lot of myths about fairness that aren't actually true. What are some of the most prevalent myths that you debunk in this book?
We already talked about one big one, which is this idea that we need to change people's beliefs or attitudes in order to change their behaviors. Research simply shows that we actually can change people's behaviors without changing the underlying beliefs. Another one is that we can outsource the work of fairness to a handful of individuals in organizations. This idea that if only we hire, let's say, a chief diversity officer or have a dedicated team of 5 people, we can magically, quote unquote, fix fairness for a whole company. And I think here about how organizations approach communication, which is another core feature of all organizations. Most companies will have a PR department or a corporate communications department of a couple of individuals, and they handle the CEO speeches and the annual report and some of these most high-profile communication moments. But at the same time, every single person in the whole company on a daily basis is writing emails, they're preparing slide decks, they're speaking up in meetings. In other words, everyone has to have a base level of communication skills in order for the work of the organization to happen on a daily basis. And I would argue that it's exactly the same with fairness. Yes, experts can be extremely valuable in sharing the latest research, in helping point us to evidence-based practices and saying, oh, we have to collect this data, we should tweak this project or process in XYZ ways. But everyone who's running a meeting or attending a meeting, everyone who's hiring people, evaluating another colleague's performance, making decisions about promotions, making decisions about where people can work from and when, and who gets to take what type of leave and for what reason. All of these people are at the front lines of having the opportunity to either embed fairness or unfairness into the organization. And that's why it has to be everybody's job. And I think if we manage to make this mindset shift, that people realize that short of serving on a task force or becoming a DEI or HR professional, I have a role to play in my teams and my organization's fairness on an everyday basis. That's how we could start to see transformative results.
Mm-hmm. You actually make the point. I liked the way you did this. That often women and minorities need to do more than men to be seen as equal when they're working in roles that are not traditionally women's roles. For example, female surgeons aren't given the same respect and authority as male counterparts due to gender stereotypes.
Yeah,
they behave more deferentially toward female nurses they work with, and this managing down hurt their performance overall in their careers. I feel that this hurdle is an invisible situation to many people. Why does this situation continue to persist after all of the awareness that has been, being spread about equality and women in the workplace and that sort of thing?
Yeah. In my experience, it's not invisible to the millions of women who encounter this reality in the workplace on a daily basis.
Sure.
The problem is that oftentimes organizational leaders who remain disproportionately men, who in the US remain disproportionately white, who in many industries remain disproportionately from socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds, having gone to a select set of schools and so forth, right? What we're seeing, and the data bears this out, for example, in terms of people's earnings, is that the reality that the most senior decision makers live in their own lives is not the reality that their employees up and down the organization are living. So I would encourage all senior leaders to, number one, recognize this, and then number two, start listening to their people who have different experiences and say, hey, I work equally as hard, but come promotion time, it's always some other guy that gets promoted and not me. Or look, I just said this in the meeting. Nobody picked up on my idea. And then 5 minutes later, John said the same thing and everyone thought it was the most brilliant idea. Why didn't we hear it when I said it 5 minutes earlier? These examples abound in everyday life. They are, unfortunately, as I said, very, very visible and very salient to the people who are experiencing them. But those dynamics are not impossible to change. Meetings, for example, great situation to put what we call micro-sponsorship into practice immediately. Micro-sponsorship is small everyday acts of support and affirmation that you provide to people. It doesn't take any special training. It doesn't take any kind of formal program. Anyone can be a micro-sponsor in any minute, which is why I think this concept is so powerful. So in meetings, for example, if you see somebody's idea being overlooked and you happen to notice this, you can jump in right away and say, hey, I just wanted to lift up Amanda's amazing idea that she mentioned 5 minutes ago. I think it's so great because of X. Amanda, do you want to expand further on that? Or if somebody gets interrupted, you can jump in and interrupt the interrupter and say, oh, excuse me, Al, I look forward to hearing your point, but could we please let James finish his first, please? Right?
I represent that remark.
Sorry, just to throw you under the bus there, Al. But the point is that once we see these dynamics, once the protective glasses are taken off, they're hard to unsee. And fortunately, the good news is we all can do something about these dynamics on a daily basis in our work.
One thing I want to highlight that you talk about in the book as well is women in STEM fields and kind of the cult of brilliance and how, it's men are seen as brilliant and women don't see themselves as brilliant because of the societal situation.
Yeah,
And
stereotypes.
One of the quotes, there was research done at what age this starts to creep in. It says by age 6, research suggests American children have absorbed the association of intellectual brilliance and genius with men more than women. And girls self-direct away from games where you need to be really smart. And this carries through to choice of school and profession. Did you feel that impact going through physics and chemistry for your BA?
Yeah, I think that study is one of the most heartbreaking that we share in the book. And to be clear, when that same experiment was done on 4-year-olds, you didn't see a gender difference. So girls and boys were equally as likely to self-select to play the game that the researchers had said was for very, very smart kids. And by age 6, you started to see those gender differences emerge. I've reflected on that question myself many times. If the world had been a different place, might I have stayed in physics, gone on to pursue a PhD, become a professor of physics like my 18-year-old self imagined that I would? I don't know. But as I said earlier, I think everything happens for a reason. In my case, I'm very happy about where I landed because I feel like I found my calling with this work of being a researcher in the social sciences instead, and examining how organizations can, in a data-backed, evidence-based way, actually level the playing field. Mm-hmm. But we can't deny the fact that these small cues and constant reminders from the environment that you don't belong, they make a difference and they accumulate over time. So one example of how that played out for me in college is when I'd meet new classmates, one of the first questions people tend to ask each other is, so what do you study? What's your major? Mm-hmm. And when I said chemistry and physics, people would often respond with a quizzical look and be like, oh, really? I thought you would have been like French literature or something.
Ouch.
And at the time, I didn't make anything of it. I just brushed it off and said, well, I'm not for French literature. I major in chemistry and physics. But now, in retrospect, knowing everything that I know, I have the vocabulary and the knowledge to now understand that those were actually expressions of societal stereotypes. People didn't mean any harm by them, but those comments came out of the fact and the expectations that we have for women or don't have for women.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's something I've looked into. I've done, previous podcasts looking at women in STEM and trying to figure out, what are the main factors that lead to this loss of women in engineering and physics and some of these fields. And, that was something that came up. So I was wondering, how do we address this? Obviously, talking to your kids, countering the stereotype when it comes up. What else can we do?
Yeah, it definitely starts in childhood for sure with the toys that we give our kids. Parents often unconsciously and unintentionally direct their children to play with certain types of toys. And then, well-meaning family members, they'll give a girl a dress or a Barbie doll for Christmas and the boy will get a Lego set, right? I mean, we're all guilty as parents, as aunts, as uncles, of all of this. But the good news is there are hopeful examples even much later on of how this can work. And one I'd like to share is, the story of Harvey Mudd College in California, which is a science technology focused college that was led by Maria Klawe, the first female president there, who stepped down just a few years ago. She was, prior to that, the dean of engineering at Princeton. Mm-hmm. And when she took over, only 10-15% of concentrators in computer science or majors in computer science were women. And she set out to increase that share in a very purposeful, multi-pronged way. In 5 or 6 years' time, they had gotten women to more than 50% of their computer science majors. So what did they do? They invested in hiring more female faculty and putting female faculty in leadership positions to serve as role models for students. They also changed the way they taught their introductory computer science course, because one of the things that they discovered is while many girls and boys, or women and men, expressed an interest as freshmen, as first years in studying computer science, the men tended to have more past experience, either having already coded on their own in high school, having taken some classes in high school, having had other exposure to computer science than the women. So when you put all of these people in a classroom together, even though it still was an introductory course, the men were already light years ahead. And it made the women feel like, oh my gosh, I can never succeed because I'm so much worse than these guys. I'll never have a path to be successful in these studies. So they split the introductory course into 2 tracks. One was for those, students of any gender who were actual beginners in computer science. And the other track was for those who had had prior experience.
Good idea.
Importantly, though, they took the same tests and were expected to have the same level of knowledge by the end of the course. So that the so-called advanced track, and it wasn't called that, by the way, they were called gold and black, the 2 different tracks instead of beginner and advanced. That's an important insight from psychology. No one wants to be a beginner anywhere, ever.
True.
Those students were given other topics to study, kind of extra stimulation in a lateral sense instead of in a kind of vertical sense where you would have built up more knowledge in those same topics that the other group was studying, so that they would have gotten even further ahead. They also helped through research programs expose students earlier on to what it was like to actually do computer science work and research as an extracurricular during the term, during their summer breaks. And then they had a program to sponsor female students to attend the Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Computing, the world's largest annual conference for women in tech. Again, to expose them to more role models and to show them in the real world what careers in tech could look like so that they could envision themselves there in the future. So they did all of these things at once. So it's impossible to know which of these made the biggest difference or how big of a difference. But you get the idea that it was a multi-pronged strategic approach to saying, hey, this is a big problem. We know we want to solve it. And we know that there's 10 things that we can do. So let's do the 10 things. And in fact, it yielded phenomenal results.
Okay. Well, you have a quantitative or rough remember of what the actual improvement was?
Yes. So I believe women made up 12% of the computer science students at Harvey Mudd when Maria Klawe took over. And within 5 years, they had increased that fraction to more than 50. And they stayed there since then. So even today, slightly more than half of the computer science majors at Harvey Mudd are women. Their faculty is more than 40% women. And I want to put this in context because the national average remains around 20% of computer science students being women. So they really have done an outstanding job, and they're sort of a model of excellence for all of us to follow.
Wow, that's good. Now I want to go back to corporate world a little bit. Because a lot of your book is talking about, training and policies that promote fairness in work. What, in your opinion, are the most effective interventions to close gender equity gaps in corporate world? Which ones are high on your list? I mean, for example, you mentioned parental leave. That was one that I have talked about in the past as well. The fact that women are expected to take more parental leave than men. Well, obviously, that's going to create a step.
Yeah. Let me come back to parental leave in just 1 second, but I love this question, Al, because it's actually one of the questions that inspired us to write this book. My co-author and Iris and I always get asked, what's the one thing that we should do? What's the one thing that our company should do? And the answer is there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing. Because every organization, depending on their current practices and their current status, probably has slightly different challenges. So I often get questions like, should we invest in this new software that helps us anonymize applications when we're hiring people? And my honest answer is, I don't know. Because I don't know if you're currently biased against certain types of applicants in the hiring process. But I can tell you how to find out. Look at your applicant pool at every single stage of the process. Who do you get resumes in from? Or who expresses interest in your job advertisements by engaging with them online in the many channels where they're posted? Then who submits a resume? Who do you select for a phone screen? Who do you select for an interview, right? You look at all these different stages in the process and you look at the data on the composition of the applicant pool by age, by gender, by geography, by race. I mean, pick any metric that you're interested in. And then see, are there discrepancies? If, let's say, your applicant pool is 50-50 women and men, but then in that resume screening step, all of a sudden you skew to 70% men and 30% women, well, that is an indication that there's something going on in the resume screening step that's disproportionately excluding women and disproportionately including men. So that might be a step that you want to revisit. But the point is every organization is different. And so they need to do these data-driven analyses for themselves to pinpoint where they have the biggest challenges and then tackle those. That's why we give evidence-based advice in the book for all of these different stages of organizational life. But to come back to your specific question about parental leave, that is definitely a major lever for organizations, especially in places like the US where we don't have national paid parental leave. So organizations have an outside role, and I would almost say outside responsibility to level the playing field in this regard. And one of the best ways that we could do that with parental leave is to be a little bit more generous about the leave that we offer than we already are in many cases. And then importantly, to make the leave gender neutral, which means parents of all genders get the same amount of time off, regardless of how a child comes into their family, because there's inequity there too. You know, did you birth the child yourself versus were you a surrogate for somebody else versus did you adopt, and did you adopt an infant versus an 8-year-old, right? All of these parents can tell you these types of circumstances are quite different. So the best way to ensure that everyone has a chance to both thrive at home and bond with their children, but then also thrive at work, not just in the short term, but in the long term, to have a little amount of time away, not derail their whole career advancement, is to make sure that all parents get to take some time off. And specifically, to your point, that men don't take just 2 weeks, let's say, where women take 3 months, because that's, of course, going to create a huge disparity in the workplace with your advancement, with your promotion timeframes, with your compensation, with your bonuses. But the other half of that equation that we don't often focus on is the inequity that it creates at home. Because whichever parent is there learning how to swaddle the baby and which cry means what and when do they need food, well, once one parent learns those routines early on, it often happens that that parent then becomes the point person for a long, long time thereafter to kind of handle all the household issues.
Yes, it leaves the woman as the default parent, and then that carries through schooling, and it carries through all sorts of things, which is significant career imbalance. If you're looking for equity, this is one of the easier things to hit, I think.
Exactly. And then there's the virtuous cycle of role modeling that kicks in. The more men that take parental leave, the more normalized it becomes. And then across society, across all of different contexts, we get more accustomed to seeing men pushing strollers in the streets, going to the playground with their kids. The father being the primary contact point for the school or for the pediatrician's office. So it starts to slowly trickle into all of these other contexts where we currently still encounter some pretty strong gender stereotypes.
Indeed. So another thing that you bring up, another corporate practice that you highlight is cultural expectations of working a lot of overtime. Does overwork preferentially favor men over women? And I think, if you have this hangover that the women are responsible for the household and the men are typically, don't have these things, then you push them into having to do overtime as an expectation. It'd be interesting to talk about that, because I found, what you said about that very interesting.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic. And our colleague and Nobel Prize winner Claudia Golden's work has been really influential here. She has shown that the way compensation has evolved over the last half century or so in the US and in many other developed economies is such that we have nonlinear payoffs to time. what that means in layperson's terms is if you have a couple where you have the option of either both people working 40 hours each a week, a regular 9-to-5 job, or one person staying at home fully and working 0 hours, and the other person taking on a super demanding high-powered job that requires 80 hours of work a week, that second couple collectively is going to make more money than the first, where the work was split equally, 40 hours and 40 hours, even though in both cases, the couple in total works 80 hours a week. And it's because the jobs that require this 24/7 availability, you're answering emails, doing calls on weekends, you're available at the drop of the hat to jump on a plane and go do a client meeting, those jobs disproportionately reward that extra availability. So it means that working an 80-hour job is actually more than 2 times the compensation of working a 40-hour job, even though it's exactly 2 times the number of hours. And it connects to broader societal gender inequality because in a lot of couples where you've got 2 working people, especially if children comes along, someone has to flex a little bit. Even if no one stays fully at home, someone has to be the person who, again, is willing to be on call when the daycare calls and says, oh, your kid has gotten sick, you have to come and pick them up. Because women across this economy are still paid on average 16 cents less than men on the dollar. So our pay gap is about 16% in the US, as according to the latest numbers. It makes economical sense for the less earning spouse to become the one who flexes. And then that effect compounds and, of course, damages their earnings ability even more in the future. So these things are connected because if women and men earned across the economy the same amount, if you have 2 spouses who make exactly the same amount, it's no longer obvious which of them should become the flexing parent. Now we can actually have a conversation about, wait, well, is it better timing for you or for me, or who wants to stay more or whatever? But unfortunately, in way too many couples today, you don't even get to that conversation because it's an economic necessity or an economic imperative for the woman to be the one that flexes.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I hadn't, thought of before you highlighted that. So very, very interesting point. You also discuss at one point the benefits of a 4-day work week. What did you find there? I like that investigation quite a bit.
This is a fascinating new facet of flexible working. And I have to concede, I'm not personally the one who has done these studies, but we've connected with the researchers that have been studying the concept of a 4-day work week around the world. And it's a very promising way to create a workplace that's more compatible with people's lives outside of work while retaining high levels of productivity and actual output. So the concept is very simple. Instead of working 5 days a week and having 2 days for a weekend, you instead work 4 and have 3 off. And people will say, well, how is that possible? Does that mean that you just cram 5 days worth of work into 4 and actually end up working much longer days? Well, not exactly. The thousands of organizations that have taken part in studies around the world have found that the best way to make a 4-day work week work is for people to become much more critical about what is work that truly needs to get done and what is stuff that's filling up their calendar and their time that's actually not that necessary. I encourage everybody listening to take this challenge for yourself just for fun for 1 week. Okay. Either for the full week or 1 day at a time. See if you could cut out 20% of something that you're doing. Could you do your laundry in 20% of the 20% less time by being more efficient? If you have 5 meetings on your calendar today, could you simply drop one of them? Would the world still keep spinning? If you are in a meeting that's scheduled to take an hour, could you finish that meeting in 48 minutes, right? You get my point. The reality is there is a lot of fluff and there is a lot of overwork that doesn't serve a purpose in many of our lives. And when we push ourselves to really evaluate, does this have to happen? Does it have to happen to this extent or with this amount of time commitment? The answer often is that we can scale back some of the time involved without negatively impacting the output or the results.
Yeah, I'm sure that effectiveness of work is also, highly variable over the course of a day as your circadian rhythm
Yes.
changes. Certainly, you find a lot of the time that you're just filling in hours when you're not available to. Your brain isn't in gear, for example. It feels like you're not doing anything. You're just wasting your time. But
Yes.
I mean, how do you work around that, right? If you're, say, cutting back hours to a 4-day work week without increasing the hours, you still have this daily cycle problem. How does that work out?
Well, then that is a need there for us to re-examine our other patterns of working as well, right? So something that many of the organizations that have a 4-day work week do is they have designated times for people's focus work when they are working independently, doing the thinking or the writing or whatever it is. That is really in many ways the cornerstone of productivity for most organizations. And then you have designated blocks of time for meetings, for brainstorming, for collaboration, for interacting, which is also, of course, necessary. It's the glue that holds our organizations together. But anyone who's ever sat in a meeting knows that often you sit there and then leave with a mile-long to-do list to actually do the work that needs to get done to move the organization forward. The fact of sitting in a meeting is not necessarily the thing that moves the organization forward. And I think a lot of this is happening as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic as well, because it really forced us to re-examine how we do work, when and where, and what are the best ways to organize it. And we're very much in the middle of this sort of grand global experiment, this revolution that's bringing us to the next stage of the future of work. So it's not like there's one right way, but I think we all could afford to be much more critical and curious and inquisitive about, wait a second, just because we've done work a certain way before, is it the best way? Does it make sense? Does it make sense that anyone can pop a meeting on anyone else's calendar at any time? Or should we perhaps put some guardrails around when do meetings happen or when do they not happen? Just as one example.
It's a very good suggestion. Getting toward the end of our time slot here, I just want to ask you, I asked you about the best interventions. Now, what about the worst interventions? I know, there's a lot of blowback about, DEI in popular culture, and, there's controversy, and I'm sure some of these policies have negative impacts. What should we not be doing?
At a high level, we shouldn't be copying and pasting other people's practices without testing and evaluating whether they work for us, right? It's hardly the case, very rarely the case, that there is a silver bullet solution that works for everybody in every context. But on the flip side, it's not often the case that something is a total disaster anywhere and everywhere it's ever been tried, right? So our book lays out dozens upon dozens of evidence-based practices that have been proven to work in many different contexts, many different kinds of organizations, sizes of organizations around the world. But does that mean that they're guaranteed to work for you and your team and your company? I can't promise that. Ultimately, you have to try them out and test and see if they work. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we're making right now is often in the field of kind of organizational design and how we manage our work. We don't approach it with that experimental mindset. We're not actually evaluating how well our practices are truly working for us. And if we started doing that, we could pinpoint the promising practices earlier and double down on them. And we could also nix the ineffective practices and then try something else much faster.
Yes. Rationality and evidence is key
in action
in just about everything that we do. So I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to chat with you today. Thank you for coming on The Rational View, Siri.
Thank you, Al. It was absolutely a pleasure. What a fun conversation.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.